And welcome to Guiding Gettysburg. I have a wonderful human interest story for you today that occurred 158 years ago right here in Gettysburg. It's a feel-good story, so if you need a break from the real world, just sit back and relax and let me take you back in time. A woman was out walking a few days after the battle, and she spotted what appeared to be a soldier leaning up against a tree in a field. She went over to check out the situation, and she discovered it was a Union soldier. He happened to be a sergeant, she could tell by the chevrons on his sleeve. In his hand was an ambrotype of 3 children. He must have died looking at the ambrotype and wishing he could be with them. The woman felt very sad, and she reported what she found to the authorities in town. They came out and investigated, and they buried this man right where they found him. Keep in mind, there were bodies all over Gettysburg from the battle, and the most important thing was to get these bodies underground as soon as possible. A surgeon who was volunteering in town heard about the story of the soldier and the photo of his family. He thought it would be a good idea to have a fundraiser, and maybe once they discovered who the family was, they could give the money to the widow and the grieving children. So he had copies of the photo made up. He had 1,000 copies printed and sold them for 25 cents each. It struck the hearts of people in town, and they've started purchasing the ambrotype photos, and it caught on. The newspapers picked up the story. First the local papers like in Gettysburg and York, then it spread to the Northeast, and some of the bigger newspapers picked it up. And one morning in New York, a woman was getting ready to read her morning paper. She flipped it open, and there on the front cover was a photo of her 3 children. Immediately, Felinda Humiston knew that her husband was killed in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What an awful way to find out about the death of a loved one, let alone your husband. All of a sudden, she had become a widow, and her children had become orphans for the most part. Because women were not employed, they could not provide for their kids if their husbands died. This was one of the recurring tragedies of the Civil War. Not only did you lose your husband and your father, you lost your main provider as well. And this was a real problem. Felinda reported to the authorities here in town about her husband. His name was Amos Humiston. He was with the 154th New York Infantry, and they fought at the Battle of the Brickyard, just north on the same street where he was found. The people of Gettysburg were very much touched by this tragic story, and they began buying more of the photos. Sunday schools around town began collecting money. The children from the schools collected money for the Humiston children. It became a popular thing, to collect money for these orphans, and one day they hoped to have an orphanage and take care of the widows and children. For now, the photos were bringing enough money for the Humiston family to come to Gettysburg so they could see where their father and husband was buried. He would be in the National Cemetery, and he is still there to this day. There was talk of opening an orphanage, a national orphanage, for the children of the fallen soldiers. And it was suggested, because of the Humiston story, that the orphanage be right in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There was an existing building on Baltimore Street, and it would be most suitable for an orphanage, and this is where they directed the money towards the purchase of that building, and it would be called the National Orphans Homestead. In 1866, the money was completed to buy the building, but they still needed a matron, and people in town suggested that Philinda Humiston could be the matron of the new building. Along with her 3 kids, they would all live there together, and they would be close to Amos's grave in the National Cemetery. What a good idea this was. The plan worked out wonderfully. Philinda was so glad to have a way to support her children, and the children could live there, and she didn't have to worry about a roof over their head or a way to feed them. It worked out the best way it possibly could. Philinda was known to be a really good matron of the orphanage. She made clothes for the children. She fed them as best as she could with the money that they had. This orphanage, was not government funded at all. It was funded by providers and by Sunday schools. So they were very glad for all the money that they could get. The children were well educated and well behaved, and it went on like this for several years. As the Humiston children grew up in the orphanage, Frank was the oldest one, and he had thoughts of going to college. Philinda met a man who was a lieutenant in the Union Army, and they fell in love, and he proposed to her and wanted to get married. And she said yes. His name was Lieutenant Asa Barnes, and he was a reverend in the Union Army. They would move back to Massachusetts, which was where he was from, and the children would come too, except for Frank. Frank would stay at the orphanage and go on further to study in college. In spite of Amos Humiston's death, he was able to provide for his wife and children out of the goodness and kindness of the people of Gettysburg and the whole Northeast. We thank him for being a patriot and for his sacrifice. There is a memorial at the Gettysburg Fire Department out on the lawn, and you'll see a picture of it here on the thumbnail. It's really nice that they did this. I hope you enjoyed this story. It makes me feel good, and I hope it does the same for you. Take care, and see you next time. Bye-bye.